Thank you everybody for joining. Good afternoon, good morning, depending upon where you're dialing in from. Welcome to this Planet Tracker webinar, which is being presented as part of the UN Food Systems Summit 2021 Dialogues. My name is Peter Elwin. I'm the Director of Fixed Income at Planet Tracker, and I'm also head of our Food and Land Use program. And I'm one of the authors of the report we're talking about today, called No Rain on the Plain, which is looking at the deforestation and regional climate feedback loop, and particularly focused on Brazil. I'm going to be joined by a number of panelists once we've talked through the slide pack, talked through the report. So I'll introduce them at that stage and get them to turn their cameras on when I do that. But first, what I'd like to do is just to quickly run through our report, which provides the sort of backdrop to what we're talking about this afternoon, and a very important input in terms of the discussions going on at the UN Food Systems Summit. So if we can have the next slide, please. So the report that we've just published is looking at a really, really important issue as far as Brazil is concerned. And it's not just an issue that applies to Brazil, it will apply to other countries with very significant natural forests where deforestation is taking place. The essence of what we're talking about here today is the fact that deforestation is not just a bad thing for the planet. It doesn't just sort of cause climate change issues and release carbon across the whole planet, but it actually causes regional climate change issues as well, and thus threatens Brazil's economic sustainability if this process were to continue. Now, it's important to understand the backdrop in terms of the deforestation going on in Brazil and why this is a particularly pertinent issue, obviously, for the agribusiness sector there. A technique called double cropping has been growing in use in Brazil. As you can see from the small graph, the top right-hand side here, double cropping has really increased as a technique over the last 10 years. The concept behind double cropping is really very simple. You're using the same piece of land to grow two crops sequentially. So very often, as sort of hinted at in terms of this graph, you're growing soy first, and then you're growing a maize crop second. Now, in order to be able to do that, you need very predictable weather patterns. You need to know when it's going to be dry, when it's going to be hot, when you can sow, when you can harvest, because obviously you have to have harvested your first crop before you can start sowing the second crop. And any delay with the first crop will squeeze the window available for successfully growing the second crop. And that's the sort of that's the essence of what's going on here in terms of this double cropping system. And you can see, bottom right-hand chart, the extent to which Brazil's agribusiness success has been supported by double cropping in recent years. That massive growth sort of since 2010, when double cropping really began to kick in as a technique, particularly in Mato Grosso, one of the main sort of productive states where it's practiced. And as you can see here, this graph of soybean production, Brazil is very nearly up there with the USA as a producer of soybeans. And that's largely been facilitated by this double cropping process. So the technology and the productive land has been absolutely essential. Now, the challenge is that a lot of that sort of land has become available because of deforestation, which is the issue that we'll come on to in a moment. But let's just look at double cropping in a bit more detail for a second or two. So on the next slide, here you can see the gamble, if you like, that a farmer is taking when they're double cropping. So if you've got a single crop, you've got that greater flexibility. If the rains are delayed, if the dry season isn't coming when you expect it, you can delay the sowing a bit, you can delay the harvesting a bit, because you've got that sort of time frame to play with. With double cropping, it's obviously much more efficient use of land and therefore significantly greater income if you're successful. But the disadvantage, as I mentioned, is that any delay planting the first crop squeezes the timetable for the second crop. And you can see in that sort of simplistic calendar at the bottom of the slide there that the tight timetable that you have in order to get your second crop in the ground, get it growing, and then get it successfully harvested before the rainy season cuts in. And any shift in those rainy seasons, any change in the amount of rainfall that you're actually getting is going to cause significant difficulties and potentially the loss of that entire second crop, which would be quite a significant financial hit. Let's have a look at the next slide. This gives you a very clear picture of just how strongly sort of linked agricultural production and deforestation are as far as Brazil is concerned. You can see that that soy production really expanding in from sort of 2010 onwards, and the deforestation that's been going on right away from sort of the early 1990s all the way through. That sort of trajectory apparently flattening off, but that rather disguises what's been going on in the very recent years. This is actually the sort of the percentage of forest cover illustrated on this graph, rather than the amount of sort of forest which is being deforested in any particular year. And unfortunately, that has picked up quite dramatically over the last couple of years. So in essence, Brazil is consuming its natural capital base in order to export soft commodities to the rest of the world. That's an inherently unsustainable model. If you actually sort of model it out, it could continue for quite a number of years. There's a lot of forest left and a lot of land that could be cleared by deforestation. But the challenge is that not only are you simply cutting down trees in order to produce crops, but as recent academic research has shown, you are actually at risk of changing the climate on which those crops depend. Now, if you have a look at the next slide, you can see this, this graphic illustrating that sort of deforestation feedback loop. So very often farmers will clear forest to create land for crops and or for agriculture in terms of cattle. That deforestation changes the way the forest operates. Particularly, it reduces the extent to which the trees are generating evapotranspiration. So they're throwing water up into the air, which is then traveling through the air and coming down in other places as rainfall. And as you may have heard, that sort of aerial waterway referred to, it's often been referred to as aerial rivers, because of the amount of water that's actually traveling from the Amazon to other parts of Brazil and other parts of South America. The estimate is that there's the same amount of water traveling through the air as is actually traveling through the Amazon River itself. So aerial river is absolutely the right sort of term to use. If you cut down the forests, you stop that aerial river being generated in the same way. You stop the trees throwing off particles which create cloud cover and help with cooling. And you stop the trees from changing wind patterns. And so you get much stronger winds blowing across the landscape, you get less rainfall, and you get much more frequent occurrence of extreme heat days. Because the other thing that the forest is doing, as the water rises, it's actually taking heat with it from ground level up into the atmosphere. So you no longer get that cooling effect, almost operating like an aircon unit. It no longer does that if you destroy the forest. So deforestation leads to regional climate change, extreme heat days, reduced rainfall, shorter rainy season, and fundamentally less productive weather. That's really the challenge about all of this. If you're trying to do a double cropping farm system, you need that predictability. And this regional climate change is destroying that. That will therefore impact crop yields. The risk is therefore farm incomes fall, and potentially farmers actually try and expand the amount of income they've got by expanding the amount of land they've got, i.e. chopping down more forest. And that's where potentially that feedback loop comes in. As deforestation continues to increase, you're actually making the land less and less productive. Now, the other thing that this graphic is illustrating, which is extremely important, are all then the knock-on effects from this sort of agribusiness behavior. The very obvious thing is farm crop yields fall, state taxes decline, farm values decline. There's an immediate hit to the agribusiness income within Brazil, and a hit to that particular part of the economy, with all the consequences that that will have in terms of employment, jobs and success in particular localities. But as well as that rather obvious effect, there are some other, perhaps slightly less obvious, but potentially even more serious effects. Brazil gets about 60% of its power from hydroelectricity. It's one of the leaders of the world in terms of hydropower. That obviously depends on water, and that water comes from the Amazon and from the other forests in Brazil, like the Cerrado. those water systems are absolutely essential for those rivers to flow. If the river levels go down, the hydropower is threatened. River transport is also becoming more and more important in Brazil. It's one of the very obvious ways of moving soft commodities around the country, from the interior to the coastal ports. That becomes impossible if the river levels are going down. And then the third effect, these extreme heat days are particularly serious for human health. We've seen that in parts of Southern Europe. We've seen that in parts of the USA over the last year. The very, very serious effects that sort of shock heat waves can have on human health. It literally kills. It certainly makes workers much less productive. Clearly, anybody working outside is potentially unable to during the middle of the day during one of these heat days. And that has a very severe effect on the economy. Even if you're working in a factory or office where you can cool it, you're going to be paying even more money to achieve that cooling effect. So the economic costs will be potentially very significant. The next slide just provides a bit of a summary of that. I think we've sort of talked through all of those, but it's also worth thinking about the fact that there are losses not just directly to the businesses hit, but of course to the banks that are lending to them and to the insurance companies that are providing cover. And again, we've seen that in a number of places around the world, particularly in the US with the forest fires and other sort of natural disasters that have been happening recently. The economic effects spread far and wide across the Brazilian economy, potentially. On to the final slide. What is there that can be done? What can investors do? What can investors encourage the Brazilian government to do? Very obvious things will be to strengthen government policies relating to climate and nature, particularly reversing cuts to the Ministry of the Environment, encouraging public spending to incentivize sustainable agribusiness practices, and there are a lot of efforts going on to do that. Already some encouraging developments, particularly in terms of the way the central bank in Brazil is actually constructing its relationships with the other banks. Investing in a green recovery, a very obvious point to make. There's a huge amount we could say about that, but time prevents a detailed discussion of that. And then the final thing I wanted to flag is that we produced a separate report just suggesting a deforestation-linked sovereign bond might be one capital markets instrument that the Brazilian government could use as a way of effectively putting its money where its deforestation ambitions are, and gaining a capital markets link between success in limiting deforestation and the coupon rates that it's actually paying on some of its government debt. So that's a brief summary of the report that we've just published. You've got a link to that in the chat. What I'd like to do now is open up the discussion to our other panelists. So if we can get rid of the slide, and panelists, if you can put your cameras on. So I'm delighted to have three experts with me to sort of contribute their own thoughts to this very important discussion. So I'd like to welcome Tatiana Gasparato from the Climate Bonds Initiative. Tatiana is the Associate Director of Regions for the CBI, and she will be speaking first. But before she does, I'd also like to welcome Anna Lima, who is Head of Environmental Issues for the Principles for Responsible Investing. And finally, last but not least, Paola Piero, who is the Partnership Manager for IFAC, which you may not have heard of because it's a very new, innovative finance for Amazon, Cerrado, and Chaco. So we're delighted to have all three of you with us today to discuss this issue and to give your thoughts on what needs to be done. So I'll throw it first over to Tatiana, and then Anna will come in, and then Paola at the end. Tatiana, over to you.
Thank you very much, Peter. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. Very, very nice to be amongst very esteemed colleagues. Anna, Paula, very nice to see you again. And thank you, Planet Tracker, for the invitation. Right, so just as a context for those who don't know us, who may not know us, so CBI works primarily in debt capital markets, shifting capital flows towards low carbon investment and solutions, and very much focused on the green bond market, green debt space, but very, very rapidly transitioning into other labels and other needs of the market, and such as transition. With that, one of the key areas that we focus on is on international market development, which is the area that I currently oversee at CBI. Since we began the program in Brazil probably about 6 or 7 years ago now, one of the biggest potentials that we always saw was the potential for sustainable finance for Brazilian agriculture, for sustainable agriculture. And we, at the time, there was virtually no issuances attached to the land use space. It's a very, very new sector from a sustainable finance perspective, primarily because the eligibility and the qualification of assets within the agriculture space are not that obvious, right? As you would have, for instance, with solar assets or wind assets, for instance. So, and part of that work is also, attached to what CBI does in terms of developing metrics and standards for all the different sectors of the economy. So with that, since 2017-18, we've been working on a specific agriculture program out of Brazil to do a few things. One is to build out that pipeline, so to carve out literally what could be eligible and what are the opportunities, and very much in the sense that you were framing, Peter. We appreciate there are many problems. What are some of the solutions? And I think everyone will agree that finance always comes up as that kind of overarching hurdle to be overcome when it comes to changing production practices. So identifying what that pipeline is has been a focus of that work. And just last year, we published an investment roadmap where we identified approximately $163 billion in investment opportunities by 2030. Now, this is not to say that 100% of that, is immediately qualified as green, but that we do see large potential, and it does involve things like, recovery of degraded pasture lands with, ICLF, integrated crop forest pasture techniques. It obviously looks at the enforcement of the legal reserves pipeline, which is foreseen under the National Forest Code. Things along those lines, and for anyone who's curious, you can also check that out on the CBI website. Another element to this is around financial instrument design and testing. Now, as you will know very well at Planet Tracker, the agriculture and the other colleagues as well, the agriculture sector has traditionally been extremely dependent both on public subsidy schemes, but also within the banking industry. So it's traditionally not been very familiar or close to capital markets, but obviously that is changing very rapidly. And as we know, public funds are growing scarce everywhere in the world, and this is no exception. So as capital markets mature in Brazil, and both for onshore and offshore issuances, a lot of effort has gone into that financial instrument design and testing of things such as, for instance, the CRAs, which are the receivables instruments, a securitization instrument out of Brazil. We are now with the possibility of issuing offshore CRAs, thanks to a new legislation that has been put in place. But not just that, things like funds and other aggregation platforms. So a lot of that has been focusing on that, and in connecting as the sector will necessarily need to diversify its funding sources. How can we demonstrate that by adopting low carbon production practices and by complying with certain sets of criteria, you will effectively have preferential access to capital? And I think, that is kind of the main message here, that this is in the medium to long term, it will very much mean, we believe that it will very much mean that if you're not in line with certain guidelines, you will struggle to get financing. That is not the case yet, but what we have now is the carrot to say, basically, you've got preferential access, and in many cases you've got cheaper access to capital as well. Why not do that? And not even to mention, the yield element, that this is about productivity. So it's not just about looking good with investors by any means, but actually, there's a reason why investors are very much after these types of debt products, because they say a lot about the long-term planning and the resilience and the risk mitigation aspect of that debt, right? So at the end of the day, it's all about risk mitigation. It's not about being nice and doing this out of the goodness of your heart, which of course there is that, but it's about risk mitigation and risk return balance. And then finally, just the other point I was going to mention, which is this kind of the private versus public approach to this. Obviously, I mentioned a lot about the private engagement, getting issuers to come to market, identifying what that pipeline is, getting that to market. But there is a very strong, public element to this. And you mentioned sovereign debt. You mentioned, the risk profile of the country in light of, deforestation or other problems that may arise. So within that, we've been working extensively with the Ministry of Agriculture on a number of things, including, for instance, the subsidy scheme, the Plano Safra, which has, gained strength for the low carbon element of it as of this year, but also the central bank, which has recently put out, and we've worked with them to put out guidelines on identifying sustainability indicators for the debt system for agriculture. So, also tackling and acknowledging that it's not just about capital markets. The banking industry has had a massive role to play here. They need guidance as well, and we should be working with the regulator as well as the industry. So with that, the final thing is that, a lot of that work has been focused within the farm gate, very much, upstream part of food systems. But as that work progresses and moves on to a new cycle, we will also be looking at the transition element and also the food system element of it more widely. So midstream and downstream, beyond the farm gate, and what it means for those stakeholders as we move across the supply chain.
That's fantastic. Thanks very much indeed, Tatiana. That sounds really exciting. And I love the idea that, yeah, we're providing the sort of the carrot at the moment, but at some stage, I think in perhaps not too distant future, it will become the norm to issue bonds and other financial instruments which are based around sustainability frameworks, and the exception will be what one would probably call dirty finance at that stage, and that you have to pay a premium to the market to persuade them to accept it. So we can already see that trend moving quite strongly in that direction. So Anna, the principles for responsible investment, obviously a big part of the sort of the driver, hoping to sort of shape the capital markets to move into a more sustainable direction. Can you tell us what's going on with the PRI at the moment? I mean, I know you guys are doing quite a lot of work around deforestation, but it's much bigger and broader than that. So over to you.
Thank you very much for inviting the PRI to participate in this panel. And yeah, thank you, Tatiana, for this excellent presentation. I look forward to hear Paul's as well. We hold a deep admiration for the Planet Tracker's work, and we're very happy to see how in the No Rain on the Plain, you were able to show so concretely the climate and operational impact of deforestation associated with soft commodities. So as a brief introduction, I had the environmental issues at PRI, the E of ESG, so I work mostly with the content side. And under environmental issues, we support investors to deal with risks related to the reliance and impacts on nature. So I think, a good example of what you just brought to us. And we have 4 areas of focus at the moment: land use change, which is the subject of today, biodiversity loss, circular economy, and climate physical risks. So I think today I just quickly would like to address 3 main areas. I think the first, we're talking about deforestation as a risk and how can you address this risk, and the carrot, and I think deforestation is proven like climate a systemic risk. You cannot address only in Brazil, you cannot address only in your portfolio, you have to address it systemically, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about PRI work on that. So I think first I would like to talk about the connection between deforestation and climate change that you brought to us and what that represents for investors. And then quickly talk about how unfortunately the financial sector remain very much exposed in these scenarios, and finally just brush over our program. So I think one of the things that we need to establish is that it's highly possible that deforestation will prevent the world from meeting the Paris Agreement target of limiting the increase in the global temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius. We have over half of the global GDP covered by a national net zero target, but it's very questionable whether any of these targets will be met without a significant progress on deforestation. And I think the paper you produce make a concrete case for deforestation as a systemic risk that needs immediate action. So if we focus on soft commodities, the impact of deforestation is felt mostly in areas of tropical forests. And those are areas that are highly efficient carbon sinks and hubs of biodiversity. The loss of this forest, as you said, mostly in Brazil and Indonesia, had unprecedented impact in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and biodiversity losses. And data shows that the drivers of this specific type of deforestation connected with production and consumption, we shouldn't forget, of beef, soy, and palm oil account for 11% of the emissions. So while we have the production and consumption of these 3 commodities accounting for most of the emissions, we have also at the same time the tropical forests accounting for 40% of the absorption of 40% of all the anthropogenic emissions. So it's a very large part of any net zero strategy. So as a result, point proven by you, the connection between deforestation and climate creates a significant disruptions on commodities value chain. So it leaves agricultural yields susceptible to changing weather patterns that are affected unevenly across the world, and other climate risks that are also connected to deforestation and presented by you, like the severe drought of some rivers that will eventually pose a risk to shipping routes used to export commodities, and logistical breakdowns. I mean, we have many examples in Brazil, but sometimes investors and corporates do not put the 2 and 2 together. So as a result today, if you look at a heat map, the Amazon and the Cerrado regions in Brazil, which are huge, are switching from being net carbon sinkers to net carbon emitters, which is quite serious. So if we are concerned about net zero strategies implemented, you need to make sure that we're not fighting against the very part of the solution that will enable carbon removal and the attainment of your net zero strategies. So I think for investors, I think like when we talk about producers and people on the ground, this is much more visible and concrete. For investors, this is even a greater challenge. Despite companies having a granular understanding of their value chains, investors have a very limited visibility of what portfolios are exposed. So why do we say that the financial sector remains exposed? There are 4 main reasons why we say that. I think the first one is the limited scope of commitments. the commitments do not cover beyond companies and investors' direct operations, and we know the indirect supply chains and indirect suppliers concentrate most of the problems. In these supply chains, indirect suppliers bear a significant amount of the risk. And for many companies, their supply chains are complicated and multi-tiered, and full transparency is very difficult to achieve. The second reason why financial sector remains exposed is the assumption associated with a company having a net zero strategy and their commitment to climate change. In net zero strategy, instead of focusing on eliminating deforestation, land management are typically presented in the context of carbon removals for residual impact. And then at the same time, the carbon accounting methods are still going through the process of standardization. So it's very difficult to understand what's actually being done and what's comparable and can be put together. So there are no specific targets that have breached, let's say, nature and carbon emission yet. And the presumption of a climate connection is really significant because is not necessarily being addressed. I think the third issue that I would like to bring attention why financial sector remains exposed is the company commitments. We have the Forest 500, for example, that shows that 2/3 of companies have commitments, but disclosure happens in a very, very, very small number. So disclosure is not at all a common practice, and we don't understand our reliance on nature. And some initiatives try to address this, but the current levels are far from adequate. So this is a particularly complex and technical area, and I think this is the fourth and one of the most important challenge that we've got. It's not always clear where the power relationships lie within the value chain for making the change happens in terms of the way they function. And a strong understanding of the system is needed to enable change. So I like the granularity of your paper because it explains why and how deforestation and the importance of risk disclosure of volumes and origin of sourcing becomes so important. So sorry, just focusing out. So what are we doing? So the PRI understands that there is a very diverse cohort of ambitions, abilities, skills, interests, portfolios amongst our over 4,000 signatories. So we have recruited decision makers of 45 investors between asset owners and asset managers with around $29 trillion of assets under management to create a community of practice that aims to align policies, metrics, practices, and engagement targets and strategies in terms of how investors can tackle deforestation. Given all this challenge, what can we do? What can the financial landscape look at? What are the important policies, metrics, asks, so we can create resilience? So our program aims to get us there through investor action and the three main pillars. I think the first pillar is to understand deforestation as a systemic risk and be able to identify high-risk areas and the exposures within investors' portfolios. So I think, as we said, there are heat maps and very recently our team has launched maps of natural capital depletion in partnership with NCOR and UNWCMC. And the understanding by investors of where are the vulnerable areas and where biodiversity loss is happening is fundamental. The second pillar that we look at is how investors can influence the system for sustainable supply and demand as a collective beyond investee companies. like in the portfolio, but also with policymakers, with regulators, and searching for alignment in mandatory due diligence, for example. And the third pillar is positively contribute to ESG. So how can we track the progress of investors within this group? So the target of our program is to increase traceability and disclosure in our key supply chains and sourcing governments. So we're talking about cattle, soy, and palm oil. And as PRI, we believe we can influence knowledge, tools, and coordination within the financial landscape. So in practical terms, we want to change investors' behaviors in terms of risk management, engagement, collaboration, accountability, and reporting. I think that covers. I'm happy to answer any questions.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much, Anna. That's really comprehensive, and it's brilliant what the PRI is doing to sort of really move the global capital markets to focus on these particular issues. And I think this community of practice is a really exciting practical step to get investors to think about actually what can they achieve, how do they do it, and how can they do it more quickly than perhaps they have done in the past, which is really great. I'd like to bring Paula in now, because you are looking at something, as I said at the beginning, which is really very, very new, but it's part of what Tatiana was also talking about, this sort of search for practical solutions for sort of positive things that can actually be done using finance to achieve real sort of on the ground change in key biomes in sort of South America. So Paula, over to you.
Thank you, Peter, for the invitation, and thank you, Anna and Tatiana, also for this being part of this wonderful expert team, and also for such a relevant report, Peter. We were talking a bit before this panel that it's actually very, very relevant being able to show such a direct impact that deforestation can cause on the field. It comes to show exactly how deforestation will cause not only an environmental impact, is causing already also economic impact, a social impact. It is a complex problem, and we need to act urgently. I will try to be quick because I know we are pressed in time, but as Peter mentioned, I'm here to talk a little bit about a new initiative called IFAC, Innovative Finance for Amazon, Cerrado, and Chaco. It's an initiative joined by 3 partners, the Tropical Forest Alliance, the Nature Conservancy, and UNEP Climate Finance Units. And well, the context of the initiative is exactly what we've been talking about in this panel. It is a joint discussion on obviously deforestation as a systemic risk brought about in these 3 biomes. Agriculture coming in as a great inducer of deforestation in these 3 biomes. But one more point that I just wanted to bring into the context is the discussion of food security. A new report that came out from TFA last week shows that the annual consumption of agricultural products increased over 40% annually from 2001 to 2010. And we're going to see an increase even more of 60% in the coming decades of agricultural production in an ever increasing population. So we do have complex problems to discuss, and we do need to start discussing this transition. How are we going to create the transition on the field to more sustainable agricultural production with no conversion, in order for us to really halt biodiversity loss and halt conversion, which is something that we obviously urgently need, given all of the discussion that we've been having up until now. So that is where the context of IFAC comes in. So the Nature Conservancy in the past 5 years has been working in these 3 biomes, trying to, in the field, do business cases, trying to show how sustainable intensification and sustainable agriculture over expansion over consolidated lands and integrated practices with no conversion has positive financial results. And moreover, they have been trying to work with creating pilot financial mechanisms on the ground, also trying to prove exactly that these financial mechanisms work. So obviously, a million lessons learned in the last 5 years together with Tati CBI, as she mentioned, 7 years ago, the program didn't exist. And now after all of these years, we have so many lessons learned, so many new mechanisms. The machine is moving. And together with that, we have UNEP, Climate Finance Unit, also having helped structure a lot of blended finance structures, and the TFA creating a series of a work with investors, a lot of projects on the field with producers as well. And so the three institutions joined to create IFAC. And so what is IFAC? What is the objective of IFAC? We are calling upon investors, financial institutions, traders, meat packers to join together and create financial mechanisms. So we are not a financial mechanism in itself. We are a network of participants, and we are calling for a commitment. By 2023, we would like to have 3 billion in commitments to be disbursed by the end of the decade. And the idea is that with this commitment, we will help them create and disburse new mechanisms. What do we have to offer if these financial institutions and investors do join IFAC? We can help create the mechanisms with all of the lessons learned. We can help in the connections. We can help create the environmental frameworks and help in the impact indicators. Remembering that there are so many initiatives and so many indicators already created. So the idea is not to create anything new. We're going to talk to CBI and figure out what are the indicators that already exist. We're going to talk to PRI and see what already they're doing in the community of practice so we can join together and work together. If the investors are too far away from the field and cannot create a financial mechanism that will help the producer directly, they can endorse IFAC. If a financial institution can create a mechanism that can help the producer directly, like a farmland investment or a long-term investment directly to the producer, we can help them. If it's a financial institution that is that works with corporates, that's also not a problem. We can help them create corporate debt instruments that on its own turn and directly will help the farmer. But the point, I think the most important point, is that we need to help the transition on the ground, and we need to start doing it now. So we do have positive solutions already. We do have positive case studies. So the idea of this new initiative is for us to start catalyzing and scaling this. We need now to scale this more than to create new niche solutions. I think that the time is now to start redirecting flow of capital in a scaled manner. I know we're out of time, so I'm not going to be able to get into the details, but if anything, we can talk a little bit more about detail afterwards.
That's fantastic. Thanks so much, Paula. Yeah, and I think actually you guys have got a webinar coming on later this afternoon, UK time, to talk about this as well. So maybe pop a link in the chat, or make sure people can see about that as well. That's really, really exciting. I think this idea of actually, as you were saying, really scaling up finance and bringing practical solutions particularly to the agribusiness sort of community in those three sort of biomes, forest areas, is really, really positive. A couple of questions that have come through. I wanted to ask one, which I think all of you've made reference in different ways to sort of disclosure, transparency, the importance of reporting. And I just wanted to ask the sort of rather blunt question. There have been a lot of initiatives around transparency. I mean, do they work? Do they matter? Is this something that investors should be encouraging and supporting, or actually should we be focused on other things? Maybe Anna, can I just sort of start with you, and then we'll throw it open, jump in anybody else who wants to. But so transparency initiatives, I mean, are they worth supporting?
That's a very good question, Peter. So to this day, we have 134 initiatives tackling deforestation associated with commodity supply chains, 8,000 300 members in the different initiatives, including companies, investors, and civil society organizations. So transparency is the main vein of all of them. But I think what we're getting at since 2014, where we could say that this whole movement has started, is the fact that we need alignment. And in that, on one hand, we're looking at global governance, between investors, corporates, producers, traders, and manufacturers. And on the other hand, a common understanding. Because there's no like that I think it's over 30 transparency initiatives that we got. We cannot have 100 different indicators saying the same thing. Investors asking from the proprietary systems different things from corporates reporting, each of them with their own beautiful glossy reports, and then traders just saying, sorry, I don't know which producer this soy comes from, all that. So we need a common narrative and a common a common ask, really, a common ask from investors all the way to the ground. And I think this is the focus of our practitioners group, and I think this should go, from the investors all the way to the farmer.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's certainly my personal experience, is that that need for a common ask. I think companies have been crying out over the last probably 20 years to just be asked the same question by everybody, rather than everybody asking their own individual question, and questionnaires and templates and all sorts of bits and pieces to be filled in. Tatiana, Paula, was there anything that you wanted to sort of add to that? You were both nodding enthusiastically as Anna was talking.
Well, sorry.
No, carry on.
I'll comment briefly. So I think, yeah, to Anna's point, I think there are a lot of initiatives. I think commenting on the debt capital market space, that's certainly the transparency and disclosure element has certainly been I'd probably say, one of the biggest, incentives for investors that are drawing investors into the market. So whereas, if you're comparing with the vanilla bond that you're not really sure, you don't have that much visibility of where the proceeds and the money is going towards, in a labeled, obviously in a robust product, labeled product, you have that. So that's definitely been driving the market for a while. Now, what I think is probably one of the key changes is, I think we've seen a lot of these initiatives for a long time, and I think perhaps some of them, when they started, they were a bit maybe overshooting in what would actually be achievable at the time. So if I go back 10, 11 years, I remember I was doing some work looking at the investment practices of the largest, the 350 largest companies operating in Brazil at the time. There were, a lot of them were signing up to this, but with significant limitations of what even they knew about themselves, let alone the suppliers, and, as you go further down into, or wider in scope. However, having said that, I also do feel that, especially within the land use space, a lot of companies have held on to that excuse in a way of saying, well, it's just not possible, this is already a big effort, and so on. And yes, it is for a lot, especially when you talk about direct and indirect purchases. If you talk about the livestock industry and so on, there are what look like little steps are actually, very, very cost intensive and all of that. But we can't close our eyes to the major developments we've seen in the ag tech space. The ag techs, the agriculture technology companies have really, really taken the sector by storm, and as recently as in the last 5 years. So in terms of data collection, monitoring, the amount of information that now is readily available, whereas 10 years ago would be extremely costly, difficult to get, not reliable, and so on, now is a lot more readily available. And there are a significant number of companies that are doing it and taking advantage of it to share with investors. So I think, just to finalize, the flip side of that as well is, what can investors ask? Right. So when we talk about the criteria that, that we developed for eligibility, which involves zero deforestation, by the way, it involves the adoption of low carbon production practices, and also involves adaptation techniques. It also comes to show that, investors can ask for this type of information now. So it's no longer whereas, oh, I don't know, I can't get this, it's too expensive, and so on. Well, actually, we're in a different situation now. You actually can have access to this information if you're willing to and committed enough.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point to make. And it's interesting. I mean, one of the other programs that Planet Tracker looks at is textiles, which I'm also in charge of. And traceability in the textile supply chain is moving on absolute leaps and bounds, with all sorts of extraordinary techniques, including sort of DNA analysis that will tell you whether it really is Egyptian cotton or some sort of substandard fake. So I think that is coming into the ag space, as you say, really, really fast. I was talking to a satellite company the other day, commercial satellite company that will sell photos down to a 0.5 meter definition. So you literally can sort of get them to read the text on your phone pretty much and report it back to you. I just wanted to finish with a final question, and Paula, maybe I'll come to you first, and you can jump onto the last question if you want to add anything to that as well. But just very sort of simply, what is the most important action, as far as you're concerned, that you think an investor can take to prevent deforestation? What's the key thing that an investor should be doing to prevent deforestation? So Paula, I'll throw that over to you first, if I may.
Okay, well, if I had only one action to ask them, I would say redirect flow of capital now. If I could ask two things, I would say redirect flow of capital now and dialogue, because I think that it is impossible for us to do one without the other. And the third one, if I may, obviously, with transparency, which is the whole discussion that we've just had. So I think we need to, with dialogue, align our asks, and most importantly, we need to redirect. The investors have I wouldn't say just the power, but they have a role in helping redirect the flow of capital and a role in this transition. They're not the only ones. All of us in the supply chain have a specific role in this very important transition in sustainable commodity production, but finance has a very crucial one. And I think that if the investors can start this redirection, it'll be the most important thing that they could possibly start doing in this year now, not in the next year, not in the next decade, but now.
That's fantastic. So now is the key. Thank you. Anna, how about you?
Well, we know that the UN high-level champions are launching today at the New York Climate Week the High Integrity Commitment Letter on Deforestation. And I do hope, on behalf of PRI, that as many investors as possible can join the race to deforestation-free finance by 2025. And along, I think, the text of the commitment letter is still to come, but I think I would raise 3 important points that I believe investors should look at. I think first, have a firm-wide, industry-wide policy to halt deforestation now. So I think there is no change in practices, there is no change in metrics, there is no change in engagement while we don't have a policy. I think that the second thing we expect investors to do is to actually assess their portfolio with, you know, all these data and tools that Tatiana has raised, and they are available in the market, at least for the three commodities that cause 73% of the deforestation: soy, palm, and cattle. You can do that. You can access your portfolio. There is data available. And the third one, yes, what about publicly reporting your progress against the milestones you set to yourself? I mean, alignment is great, but if you have public commitments, so what about public milestones and public progressing on those? So I think on the flow of having a wish list, that would be mine.
Thanks very much. That's great. And Tatiana, give you the final word.
Sure. Well, I would say two things. Check for exposure. Make sure, you know, you are actually checking for exposure and you know what that exposure actually is. We talk so much about transition right now. It's the biggest buzzword. We need to talk about portfolio transition as well. And if we look at institutional investors, that's going to be a lengthy exercise. So check for exposure and continue to drive the market with diversification. You know, we need a whole economy to be financed by 2050 and hopefully longer. And we need to continue to diversify, and including agri-food systems in those portfolios is a part of that. And then finally, I would actually just broaden the definition of investors as well. When we talk about food systems, you know, suppliers are investors in a way. They are, you know, sources of capital. We've got intermediaries that are sources of capital. We've got so many more investors than the traditional investors that we're used to looking at. So, you know, the same message of checking exposure is equally valid for those investors that have multiple hats that they wear throughout the supply chain. So those would be my points.
Thank you. That's a really great point to end on, I think. I mean, we've talked about the complexity of the food and land use supply chains, and that's something I think we're all probably very familiar with. But that point that actually there are players within the supply chain who are effectively supplying capital and funding to other parties within supply chain is really, really important. So at least part of the solution to the problem lies within the hands of supply chain participants, not just the financial markets. Well, it's just been a great discussion. It remains simply for me to say thank you so much to my three fantastic panelists. It's been wonderful to have you. It's been a privilege to be able to share our report with all of you listening in. I've put my email in the chat. If you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to get into contact, and do watch out for the launch of IFAC. That's going to be a very exciting new venture. Thanks very much, everybody. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Everyone.
Bye-bye.